Hello? Oh, they're there. They're ready. Fantastic. Hi, beautiful community. It's very good to see you. We are going to talk about another remarkable Putin speech in which he answered Western discourse about the breakup of Russia and did a classification of what is and what isn't part of Russia and part of the Russian world. And this matters because we're looking at his run up to the 24 quote unquote election, which is real and not real. It's, as I call it, it's a ritual of appearances that could affect reality more or less deleteriously for Putin. So it's important. So we'll jump and look at the early couple of paragraphs from Putin's speech, and that's it. It's a speech of about 15 paragraphs or so. We'll take 2 or 3. And then I'll make a couple of key points about what's going on there and how that translates into what we think of Putin's thinking about the war in the months to come and his wider mission to attain regime security and realize his imperialist enterprises. Now, I didn't take the translation from the Kremlin website because I quickly translated it myself, simply because Kremlin translations often leave Putin looking like a kind of farcical character from a Hollywood movie, a Russian baddie in a Hollywood movie. In reality, he sounds more compelling and more charismatic in Russian. If I'm slow, I'm still working to get my health to where it was a few weeks ago, so bear with me and hopefully we'll be connected more frequently over the days to come than we have been over the last couple of weeks. Good health to everybody who lacks it at the moment too. So, let's get on with it. Putin. Our battle for sovereignty, for justice, has without any exaggeration a national liberatory character. And here there's an implication that it is not just liberating Russia, but liberating other nations across the world that need liberation from the ghastliness of US hegemony. Because we are standing up for the security and well-being of our people, the highest historical right to be Russia, a strong independent state, a nation that is a civilization unto itself. It's a country, it is our country, Putin goes on to say, in particular, and the Russian world, that's not for the first time obstructing the path of those who claim entitlement to global domination, who claim entitlement to their exceptionalness. We are now battling not only for Russian freedom, but for the freedom of the entire world. Oh my God, the guy is reheating all kinds of very, very old cabbage. We're now battling not only for Russia's freedom, but the freedom of the entire world. We openly say that the dictatorship of a single hegemon, this is really key now, we openly say that the dictatorship of a single hegemon, and we can all see it now, is becoming increasingly decrepit. It has entered a cycle of disintegration. And to put it simply, that's a danger for the surrounding world. So I do think that that is a message that has some power, because the conversation about a lack of a world with a world order that we had, a world without a world order conversation we had on the main channel, Putin is clinging on to a truth and inserting it into a porridge of garbage that he is reheating, but nevertheless it is a truth that he is inserting in there. And so he is pointing to not just a theory of US weakness, right? But he's trying to trigger and magnify perceptions people already have about US weakness, whether it's about not giving enough support to Ukraine, whether it's about a kind of incapacity when it comes to the Israel-Hamas crisis that the US manifests. Interesting to stop here for a moment, actually, because Putin has been saying so much about what's wrong with Israel's response to the terror attack of October 7th, which is the pulverization of Gaza. And here Putin's public statements in some ways go in the opposite direction of his private sentiments, because privately he does rather have, not empathy, but he does rather have a knack for grasping, if he were in Netanyahu's position, the temptation to pulverize Gaza. There's a part of Putin that's saying, you know how you've pulverized Gaza? I'd do it more. I'd do it quicker. I'd do it in a more batty way. Because that's what I'm about. And he's privately thinking that. He's not saying that. He's saying the very opposite. But there's an interesting disconnect there. Now, let's carry on. I'll repeat myself. It's our country that is currently located in the avant-garde of the formation of a more just world order. and I want to emphasize this: without a sovereign, strong Russia, no durable global order is possible. We know, now we're getting to the disintegration of Russia point, we know what threat there is before us. Today, for all practical purposes, Putin says, the ideology of the West's ruling elite is Russophobia and other forms of racism and neo-Nazism. It is directed not only against ethnic Russians, but against all peoples of Russia. Tatars, Chechens, Avars, Tuvinians, Bashkirs, Buryats, Yakuts, Ossetians, Jews, and the Ingush, the Mari, the Altai people. We are many here. And I can't list us all, but I want to repeat, this stuff coming out of the United States is directed against all the peoples living here. The West, Putin goes on, simply doesn't need a large and multinational country as us. Our diversity and unity of cultures, traditions, languages, and ethnicities simply don't fit into the logic of Western racists and colonizers, into their cruel schemes of total depersonalization, of pulling people apart, of suppression, of exploitation. That's why they have relaunched their old wheel fiddle, that Russia is a prison of nations, and Russians themselves are a people of slaves. We've heard this stuff repeatedly for centuries. We even heard today, we even hear today that Russia is in a special need of decolonization. But what do they want in reality? To dismember Russia and plunder it. And when they see that they can't do it by force, they try to do it by sowing discord, right? And again, everything discordant on Russian territory is an enterprise of malign foreign interference. Now, before we go on, let's analyze this a little bit. Does Putin think that the desire to dismember Russia is there among Western elites? And does he think that it's realistic, that if it's not there, that it materializes? He has enormous paranoid tendencies, in my view, in this direction. But the fact that the dismembering of Russia, the disintegration of Russia, is so transparently not the position of major Western powers, except folks in Eastern Europe close to Russia, that he can't not see that either. So it's a kind of a dance. And if you were to try to square it, you'd say something like this. Dismembering Russia, in Putin's view, is not the position of major Western elites. But there are, nevertheless, malign forces in each major Western country that are trying to make it the central position. They'll probably fail, but they're trying to succeed, and they're really there. And I think that is how Putin's balancing what is an irresistible fact that the West doesn't want to dismember Russia, with persistent paranoid thoughts that it does. That's to say, if you show me, right, the last 10 major publications or gatherings or whatever on the topic of the disintegration of Russia, I'll say, well, this is an academic conference, that is a gathering of some kind of very minor project that has no influence on politics. So yes, these opinions are there, they're growing in the West, but they have virtually no hold over major Western in major Western centers of power. But when Putin sees this, he doesn't fully accept the plurality of Western societies. He'll think that if these things are out there at all, some really important forces have to be behind them. Just like he thinks that if a major newspaper in the West says something, somehow the government or the CIA have to be behind it. Otherwise, why would it be allowed to be said? So he doesn't accept the messiness, the arbitrariness and plurality of discourse in our societies as quite as real as it is. And that's why he's likely to react in a much more conspiratorial way to evidence on Twitter that 73 people from different Western countries met to paint a map of Russia and sort of divide it into 10 or 30 bits. But there's a limit to how far he can take this. So that's my summary of his view on that. Now, there's going to be a radicalization of Putin's discourse, and we can sort of frivolously call this Putin Girkinizing himself in the run-up to the election. We've often talked about Z-radical, sometimes more loosely, sometimes more precisely. The loose way of talking about this is just to say it's sort of everybody who is or seems to be more hardline than Putin's policies today. I don't accept the idea that folks are more hardline than Putin easily, because Putin is consciously elevating a nuclear risk and planning for a big existential conflict with the West. No, that doesn't mean a full-scale war with NATO. It means moving in a direction where, in one way or another, NATO might be challenged. But today, Putin is not thinking that that's possible. And so his policies today are behind the fantasies of certain radical folks, radical groups that have a grasp on a small fraction of the Russian population. A more precise way of cutting these things up might be to say that there are the Z radicals who are just a product of the regime. They parasite on the regime to such an extent that really you can call them sort of folks who cooperate, co-conspire with the regime, are products of the regime, are curated by the regime. Then there's a second group that you could call ideologues of return, and these are folks with strong histories in different bits of the Soviet Union that aren't Russia, but that they want to be Russian. Girkin is one of those. And then there are the depth of the Russian soul people. It's a third group. That includes Mr. Dugin, Mr. Prokhanov, and so on. So there is going to be bait thrown in the direction of these groups running up to the election, because it don't look too pretty, with Girkin being in prison, with Mr. Prigozhin finally receiving the ammunition he's been asking for. So something needs to be given to this group. And we're going to see that. We're going to see language, discourse given to them as bait. That's not going to excite the majority of the Russian population, who are absolutely not mobilized by the sorts of stuff that Putin is putting on the table here. There's going to be a plurality of reactions, but they're going to range across different forms, and they'll include stuff like, well, this is weird stuff he's saying, but whatever. Well, he's saying this because probably some good reason to say it, but I don't know what it is. Oh, this is a bit weird, but I'm going to look away. That's going to be kind of how that list looks of particularly the response of the depoliticized blob that we often talk about. Now, classification of the Russian Empire as Putin sees it. The Russian world, and I won't read you all the extracts, I'll just give you the classification that is implicit in the whole speech. The Russian world unites all those who feel a spiritual affinity with our motherland, who consider themselves Russian speakers and carriers of Russian history and culture, regardless of ethnicity and religion. So he's actually giving a 2 to 3 way classification. Russians include ineliminably Ukraine and Belarus, he said. Russian world includes, he very strongly implied, anything that was touched by the Soviet Union, touched by the Russian Empire. So I don't want to overstate the case. He isn't literally saying, East Germany belongs to us, Poland belongs to us. But he's certainly, at a minimum, expressing strong proprietorial rights to all of Eastern Europe. What form they take is a separate question. And then, thirdly, he's saying that, naturally, Russia contains a lot of people who are not ethnic Russians. And to that extent, Ukrainians and Belarusians are Russians, basically, the way that various peoples, of course, in Russia itself, are Russian citizens, but they're not Russian. They're not ethnic Russians. So there is a sense in which he is saying Belarusians and Ukrainians are really more us than a lot of our population is. So why this unbelievable mixture of weakness and strength? Because even from the couple paragraphs we read, you get the picture that the United States is in charge of everything and that it's weak and falling apart. And you get the picture that Russia is hemmed in and disrespected and forced into a corner, and that it's going to change the world. It's at the avant-garde of an inexorably successful historical reaction to US hegemony. And this paradox of we're so terribly weak, but we're incredibly strong. And the United States is so incredibly strong, but also deep down in some properly understood sense, terribly weak. It's a reflection of a certain kind of image, not a belief, but an image, that Russia's strength is expressed in its weakness. That's to say that Russia is strong because of its extraordinary capacity to transform from being weak to being strong, to jump from the back row to the front row of nations. That's why you persistently hear this stuff that simultaneously sounds like we're so weak, we're so weak, we're so weak, and we're going to change the world at the same time. Lots of love. I think that's it for today. Talk very, very soon.